We'd like to start honestly with just hearing your name and what year you were born, if you dare to share. These are my different years.
Yes. And that works out like this.
Yes.
I press anything.
It does all the work, just hold it near your mouth.
I'm Ilse Anke, and I was born in 1934, which makes me probably one of the oldest females.
My name is Sandra Kelly, and I was born in 1945.
Howard Cunningham, 1951.
Stephen Burdett, 1940.
Ed Helmy, 1928.
You can be the oldest male. Well, let's start off with where you grew up. And as a kid, what did your free time look like? Anyone can start.
First again, I grew up in Germany, and what else was I saying?
What did you do in your free time as a child?
As a child, we played a lot, but not like here in America. We had dolls, we had hopscotch, we had things to do outside. We were very few days or hours inside.
I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, and free time was actually free time. I went outside and I played with cats and dogs and cows and rabbits, and when looking at my children, how they handle their children now, I think my parents didn't love me at all because they hardly ever knew where I was.
So I grew up, born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, and anytime I had free time, it was best to get out of the house, and that way you weren't in the presence of your mom to get in trouble.
I grew up on a farm in central Illinois. We had dairy cattle, hogs, and chickens. And there wasn't a lot of free time, as Sandy probably knows. And whenever I had free time, I was given a pocket knife when I was very young, and I just invented all kinds of toys and things with my pocket knife. Until, of course, World War II came along, my dad left, and I think that's when my childhood more or less ended.
I grew up on a produce farm about 10 miles northwest of Savannah, Georgia. And as a free time, I can't remember after the age of about 5 or 6 of ever having free time. We had, back then we had mules to farm with. It was before the days of tractors. So you had the animals to take care of in the morning and the evening. And there was no electricity. So you had to get wood because the stove had to have fuel to burn to cook the meals 3 times a day on a wooden stove year round. So the free time that we had was from about 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon to 5 o'clock on Sunday afternoon.
So what would be a favorite toy?
My favorite toy was a little red wagon that I used to haul wood from the wood pile to the kitchen.
My favorite toy probably started out being my pocket knife, and then I had a small toolkit that I amassed. And from a very early age, I just loved to create things and build things. And so my toys were all about educating myself and having a good time building things.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit like Steve. Lincoln Logs were in my world, and it's true. I'm a big city boy. And
I made my own.
well, I could go over. We can have a whole lot of Jack. No, so moving on. And, I guess I have a lot of cars. I was a car guy from being quite young.
We didn't have cars in that days.
I had dolls and a doll buggy, but I didn't use them in the normal way. I used the doll dress up my cats, and I gave them a ride in the doll buggy. That was my favorite thing to do.
Mine was a little doll too, and actually we never had another doll. We had one doll, and Christmas was a new dress for the doll, Christmas present.
So now let's move into your teenage years. And what did hanging out with your friends look like for you when you were a teenager?
There was no hanging. We had chores. We worked. By the time we got that age, I got up in the morning and I helped milk the cows before I went to school. And when I got home from school, it was getting dinner and helping my mom do whatever she wanted to do. So, and my nearest friend lived a mile and a half away, so it wasn't convenient. We didn't hang.
And we certainly didn't have a telephone to call each other. Not even a phone in the house. I mean, my father was one of the first people who got a phone, and so constantly people were coming to use our phone. And when we wanted to see somebody, we had to go and ring the doorbell. And that's what we did. We rode a bike to the nearest friend, and then we walked, we talked, but nothing on phones, you know.
I have an addendum. We had a phone, a little crank phone where you did one long ring and one short ring for my friend. But if you talked, everybody in the neighborhood could pick up the phone and listen. So the privacy concerns today is nothing compared to
So in growing up in Toledo, there was a great sensitivity to gang problems. So in all honesty, if you were caught, quote, hanging out with more than 2 of your friends, there was a good chance some adult or police officer was going to want to know, what did you think you were doing? We did not hang out.
Hanging out with friends. I had a unique childhood. My mother was from the city, and so she expected our education, her children's education, to be of high quality. So we were taken to town every day to be educated in town. So I had a group of people that were my friends that all lived in town, and then there was a small neighborhood community like Sandy that we knew also. So I bridged two types of friends, and when I was with my friends in town during the school day, we had a lot of fun playing. The fun stopped when I arrived at home and we started doing chores, and I rarely saw my farm friends.
There is some similarity between Sandy and I because we were raised on the farm and there was no really hanging out. And as far as the telephone was, yes, we had one, but it was too tall for us short people, young people. And so we didn't use the phone for any communications. It was face to face when we got together, and that's about the only way.
We get one addendum. Yes, we had a phone in my house. It was for the use by the adults in my house. No child ever touched that phone unless it was handed to you by a parent to say something to a grandparent. That was it.
I have one. I should probably say that it was impossible to communicate with my friends other than face to face, because the first time I experienced a telephone was when I entered the University of Illinois as a freshman.
Okay, so no texting. So you were very face to face in your communications, and what about writing letters? Was that a typical thing, or you kept it face to face most of the time, or how did that play into it?
We wrote letters, yes, and especially after the war started, we had to write to soldiers, and I communicated like that. Other than that, no.
I didn't write letters other than thank you notes to relatives and things. It was all face to face, and if we got together face to face, it wasn't, we got together for a purpose. It was 4-H club, it was youth group, it was church or Sunday school. It wasn't really for communication. There was a purpose for us getting together.
We did write in our family because my mother's sister married an Englishman, and at the beginning And so our cousins went there, so we wrote to our cousins all the time. My grandmother supervised it.
Yes, we wrote letters. In fact, even during World War II, the letters was the main way of communicating. I had an older brother who was in the South Pacific, and he would write home, and we would write to him. And of course, regular postage was only 3 cents, but you had to pay 6 cents if you wanted it airmailed.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to add something to what Steve said about telephone. Steve and I met when we were in high school, freshmen in high school, and I blatantly copied in one part of the science class, so that was my excuse to talk to him. At any rate, back to the phone. He had no phone while the whole time we were dating. And we would make a plan for him to come pick me up, and we would go to the drive-in or something. But there was a good chance he wouldn't show up, and he couldn't call me because he had no phone. So I was stood up many times. So I keep telling him he owes me. He thinks he's already paid. It was quite a life he had. I mean, he had quite a story.
Life has its choices. 59 years of it.
What are one or two of your favorite holiday traditions growing up?
Mine was certainly Christmas Eve. And I mean, we had our one present perhaps under the tree. And then at midnight we went to the Catholic Church by that time. And it was strictly Lutheran until the war. But after the war we had Catholics as well, and they had a very nice service. I mean, they changed our church, they put their crucifix there, and then we listened to the midnight mass, and then we walked home. And we had something to drink, perhaps Glühwein or something, and then we went to bed. Favorite holiday?
My favorite was Christmas Eve also, because we would all get piled in the car, and then either my mom or dad would have forgotten something, and they'd go back in the house, and they'd come back out, and we'd go to Christmas Eve service, and when we got home, Santa Claus had magically arrived during our Christmas Eve service. And that was because my parents had to get up and milk the cows in the morning, and when the chores were over, then we went to church. So there was no time to open gifts in the morning when my parents could be there.
We didn't have really traditions because, as I said, World War II interrupted it, and while I was growing up until I was about 6 years old, the only people in our family, the males, were 60 years or older. All of the younger people were in the war. And during that time, we didn't really celebrate Christmas. The one thing we did do, to your point, we went to church and we said a little Bible piece and we got a sack of candy. So I guess that was one of my favorite memories.
Well, I hate to say, but we didn't have too many traditions before World War II. It just wasn't there.
So, when you were younger, what did you want to be when you grew up? And what would you have had to do to be that?
I wanted to be a pharmacist of all things, and I couldn't be. But I became a pharmacist assistant and passed that, and I later on became a translator for a pharmaceutical company. So that was working out both things together.
Did you have to go to special school?
No, I did an apprenticeship in
Okay.
pharmacy,
Okay,
and then went to language school.
okay, cool.
I wanted to be a lawyer. I had no plans, which is probably why I didn't become a lawyer. My father said he would send me to college. It was kind of unusual for girls to go to college then and then to be a lawyer. even weirder. He said he'd send me to college if I wanted to be a Lutheran school teacher or a nurse, and I took a different path.
I guess I had no real, as a child, nothing, like I didn't want to be a policeman or a fireman for reasons. Policemen were the ones that hassled you, so I didn't want to be one of them. I was always pretty good at math and science, so I guess just by process of osmosis, you went to college, and when you got done with college, you tried to find whatever career path would get you a job.
I grew up on a farm around machinery, and when my dad put me on the tractor at age 7, I couldn't reach the pedals, but I knew how to turn it off, but I got into trouble. But, I enjoyed machinery, and at an early age decided I'd like to design machinery. So I worked towards becoming an engineer. I studied math, I studied science, and prepared myself to go to the University of Illinois and become an engineer, which I did. And so that was my life's goal. I reached it. What I didn't know at that time, wisdom comes with age, is that over my engineering career, I reinvented myself 5 different times.
Well, it just so happens that we have something in common. I wanted to be an engineer from the time that I even knew the word. And then along came World War II, and we had airplanes flying around. Our house was only about 5 miles from the end of the runway where they transitioned B-24s. And I took a liking to airplanes, and I decided I wanted to be a pilot also. Well, fortunate enough, or unfortunately, I became both. But the process of becoming an engineer was entirely different of anything that you all may think about today. When I finished high school in 1945, 17 years old, the war was still going on. So I didn't have much money to go to school, so I applied. There was only 2 of us in the school, the high school class, that even thought about going to college. They didn't have anything but simple math during the high school years, 4 years. I only had one teacher that had a degree, the English teacher. The principal had a degree. The other teachers were girls who had graduated the year before from high school. So no one could teach us math. So this other boy and I went to the principal and asked him if he could teach us some additional math. So he taught us 1 year of algebra and 1 year of trigonometry. So I knew that I had to have some of that to be an engineer. Well, when I applied for entrance to the Georgia Tech in 1945, the war was still going on. So there was no problem of getting in school. I applied, I wrote a letter, and I was accepted. The problem was that there was nobody to counsel you. You didn't know anything about it. And the only thing that I had, there was no such thing as SATs. You didn't have any entrance exams, you were just accepted. So the only thing I knew was the catalog that they gave me to select the courses for any degree. No one told me which ones to take. So the first semester that I went into school, I selected 7 courses. Well, pretty quick, after about 2 weeks, I decided that I couldn't do that, so I dropped 3 of them. And it was an entirely different situation because the war wasn't over, and the war ended in August of 1945, just before I went to school. And then I had to drop out in 46 because I ran out of money. But when I wanted to get back in 48, there was no room. All the veterans had come back, and they said that I had to wait 2 years. But I had a friend that helped me get into the University of Georgia, and I got a degree from the University of Georgia. It was not easy, but we made it. But then I was drafted, before I finished college, I was drafted but joined the Air Force, and they sent me to pilot school, and I became a pilot. So I became a pilot for 28 years, and I was an engineer for 38 years.
All right, well, what are some of the major milestones that you have celebrated?
we celebrate every round birthday in Germany, and I celebrated my 25th silver anniversary with my second husband, and well, what else? I don't know. Birthdays. We are not ashamed of getting older.
I've celebrated, of course, my marriage, been married 54 years to my husband, and my birth of my 3 children. I celebrated graduating from college when I was 52. I think those are my major milestones.
I was baptized in 1964 and graduated high school and graduated college and was blessed to marry my lovely, lovely wife. I've been trying to get it right all these years. And I guess the latest milestone was when I finally got enough money in retirement account that I took voluntary early retirement to stop that grind.
Well, probably the major milestone was I married Barbara. And for 59 years, we figured it out. But there were other milestones. One of them was I did become an engineer. The other milestone was after about 10 years in engineering, I realized that I had reached my half-life, if you will, and I either had to become a different kind of engineer or change careers slightly. And I made that decision 5 times. That was a piece of wisdom that came along later in my life, and it still applies today, I believe. Milestones, we've enjoyed. We had 3 children. They all left home and earned a living. That's a milestone. We also have had an opportunity to live and work in different parts of the world. We've traveled all over the world. We've been reasonably healthy. We've had a couple of hiccups in our life, but we're still here. So I guess the milestones are that, you know, throughout our life, we've been able to live pretty comfortably and enjoy our life. And so we've realized most of the milestones that we never even knew were there.
I guess the first milestone was when I graduated from college in 1950. And then the second one was when I finished flight school and became a pilot in 1953. And the third one was, of course, when I married Marilyn in 1956. And then I guess the big one was last April. They're not here. But my son gave me a surprise birthday party for my 90th birthday. And that was one celebration. They had it on Saturday night. They had a surprise one for me, and my relatives came in from all over the United States. And then Sunday, they had one here as a reception.
We remember.
So, as you were growing up, I think I know the answer, but what was the major global event that affected your young lives?
World War II, definitely.
And how did it affect yours
Well,
for you?
first of all, we were taught that we were the master race. We had to enter, it was mandatory. You had to enter the Hitler School. So you wore a uniform and you went to meetings, and we had to be told, we were told, and we were really brainwashed that we were such a superior race and everything else. The Jewish people, after all, they killed Christ. Aren't they despicable? So we had a few old Jewish people in our town, our small town. And it was heartbreaking, because when I think back now, we had to go past their house and say something nasty, horrible, Christ kill us, whatnot.
That was the expectation.
That was the expectation, and we firmly believed it. That was the problem.
Right.
You know, Jewish people were horrible to me. And today I'm so ashamed when I meet a Jewish person. I get very tongue-tied, and sometimes they recognize, my accent. And I had a horrible experience in California when I first met my first Jewish person, and he said, "I can't stand your voice. It reminds me of everything bad that happened." And I felt horrible. So when I meet somebody from a different faith, I'm very humble, very scared, what they think of me. And very often it's a name that gives me away already,
Right. So emotional scars that
Yeah,
are with you
horrible.
still today.
Just horrible.
World War II was important to me because my dad came home in 1944, and in 1945 I was born, at the end of the war. But the major, I guess, national thing was civil rights movement for me. I was an observer of that. I wasn't a participant because there were no African Americans in the area I lived in. I didn't go to school with any until I was sent away to high school. I went to Wisconsin Lutheran High School in Milwaukee. But then the African American population in school was maybe 1%. There were not that many until we moved down here into 1964. We moved into Myriad Student Housing. I was surrounded by all kinds of nationalities and colors. So I observed it, but it was not I wasn't a participant in that. I didn't march or do anything like that.
Well, since I'm the youngest one, obviously it would be very hard for me to talk about the draft lottery in the Vietnam War. I had a, relatively speaking, low draft number. I utilized the law at that time that allowed me to go into ROTC and not have to be eligible then for the 1970 draft or the 1971 draft, which would have been my year. Both of those years I would have gone to Vietnam. I was prepared to become an officer in the United States Army if they would have allowed me to pick the branches of the service that I was entitled to pick, but it was a blessing from God. I had a professor of military science say, "You'll pick infantry or I'll not approve your application." And I told that major that if I was going to go to Vietnam in the infantry, I was going to go without a target on my helmet, and I would go as an enlisted man. So I was eligible for the draft in 1972. Kathy and I had been thinking about getting engaged, and I told her I wouldn't give her a ring until I knew whether I was going to go to Vietnam. My draft number was 120. That particular draft went to 95. We got engaged that December, and the rest, I guess, is history. I planned my entire life. I have all the respect and honor for any of my colleagues who went to Vietnam. I attended their funerals. Second lieutenant in the United States Army, life expectancy on the ground, 90 days in Vietnam in those years. I was called a coward by that professor, and I agreed with him. I said, "Big old yellow stripe, but I'm not going to go." In those years, the lieutenants had bars on the back and front of their helmet. Well, I was a target for the sniper. I said, "If I'm going to go, I'll go as a dog face." And I did. And so maybe some people think I'm a coward, but I did what I could legally to avoid conscription to go to Vietnam.
Probably World War II. My childhood ended the day my father left for the Army. I was the eldest of three. My mother had a baby. We lived in the country. We had no phone. We had no electricity. And she cooked with a stove that used wood. And so I had to grow up. And I did. Literally, we made it through 2 years till he came back. But he came back differently. We were a different family. And by that time, my childhood was over. I was just responsible. And I think the word that my grandma used to use about me at age 6, he's completely dependable.
Stage 6.
Well, I'd have to say that December the 7th, 1941, I was in church. I was in Luther League. Back then, communications wasn't too good. This happened on Sunday morning, and we didn't get the word until Sunday night. And, but that changed my whole life. It changed the world. There was devastations everywhere. And the lady over there to the left was on the other side of all of this. And it was just unbelievable what it was like during those from 1941 until 1946. Those were 4 years that I was in high school. And whether all you all believe it or not, but I drove a school bus. I started driving a school bus in the 10th grade because there was no one else around to drive the school bus. Back then they didn't have to have a formal license. You just had to know when you were born to be 16 years old. But in 1944, they changed the law and you had to have a driver's license. So the patrolman was in the county courthouse once a month. And so I borrowed my grandfather's car to drive to school that day. And I asked the principal if I could go get my driver's license, and he said yes. And so a friend of mine went with me. We drove and parked in front of the courthouse and went in the back, and the patrolman was in the back, finished paper, and he says, I guess you all came for a license? And we said, yes. He says, well, how did you get up here? And I said, well, I drove. He says, where's the car? I says, in front of the courthouse. He says, well, give the keys to your buddy and let him bring it around the back. So he brought the car around to the back, and all this time the patrolman was filling out papers, and he got through. He said, here's your temporary license. He said, your permanent license will be mailed to you. So I'm 91 years old almost, and I've never had a driver's test in my life. But World War II changed this whole world. We have things today, it was very disastrous, but we have things today that is a result of World War II, the things that they found in the space program. It's almost unbelievable what the changes I've seen in these years. And many of them was the result of World War II. And as far as Vietnam, I served during Vietnam. I flew in Vietnam. And it's hard to realize I flew one of the largest propeller-driven aircraft the Air Force has ever had, the C-124. And I finished flying that in 1969. And my wife and I went to the museum in about 1993. And I saw this airplane and I looked at it and I didn't believe that I could have flown it. The pilot sits 20 feet off of the ground. The wheels are 50 feet behind you. And when you come into land, you've got to have some good depth perception. Well, I was an instructor in that aircraft for 5 years. And it's one of the things that I want to tell you about World War II is that in the Bible, you recall that there's somewhere where the people were doing something and they had to, all the languages, they had split languages. They had to have different languages because they didn't want to communicate to get that done. Well, I don't know how many of you know, but there is one language for international air traffic control. That is because President Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill and Mr. Stalin met during World War II, and they said there has to be one language for all air traffic control. Mr. Stalin wanted Russian, but Mr. Churchill and Mr. Roosevelt overrode him. Now the international language for air traffic control is English. All air traffic control offices have to have speaking of English. All international pilots who fly the world have to speak English. Otherwise, they can't get where they want to go. That is one of the major things that came out of World War II.
That's so much more for us.
And we have a number of things like that that came from World War II, and even today, your computers and your cell phones and all, well, was a product of the spacecraft that started in 1960. So it's just unbelievable how much changes and what the effect of World War II had on this world.
So what would you all say is the biggest issue that faces your generation today?
Health issues, especially mental health. I'm scared stiff of losing my mind because I forget so many things. And then, of course, poverty. You know, if you have a major medical issue, it might cost you parts of money, and your money that you have saved might not be enough. But most of it is mental
And care.
health, right, and care. And will I find somebody to take care of me when I'm not able to anymore? Or will somebody be nice enough saying, listen, I think you should go into
Right.
assisted living. I live with my daughter right now, and well, she's busy. She would not be able to take care of me, you know. So that's one of my biggest fears.
I don't have a lot of personal fears, but I think for me, the one thing I worry about most is climate change. Not so much for me, but for my children and grandchildren, if there's going to be a livable world here in 50, 60 years. I worry a lot about that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's health, and having sufficient resources to get honorably to the end of my life. I too am concerned every time I forget something. My guess is this dementia setting in, and I worry about that.
I guess I'm concerned about these things in I guess, an offhand way, because I can't control much of it. I realize that sooner or later, my life will end, and there's nothing I can do about that. I can improve it along the way. I guess the two things that really bother me most, that have changed the most for me in my lifetime, is how people have abandoned commitment. When I was a kid, when you said you were going to do something, or when parents said they would do something, they do it. Today it's, well, I changed my mind, or maybe I'll do it. And the other thing that bothers me is respect. I mean, we grew up, we didn't agree maybe with my father, and my father would say, no, you can't do that, and I'd say, yeah. But at least it had weight, and I went with it. I didn't argue with him, I didn't fuss with him. Today I see those two things bother me most about where society's at and where is it going. The rest of it I can cope with till I'm gone.
I would have to agree with the lady that mental health is probably one of our greatest concerns right now. And the general health of the elderly people, it's obvious it is more attention because we're living longer and older, but still, I think the mental health problem is as great as there is any.
So let me finish up with you guys with like the biggest question I want to ask every panel is who passed faith to you? How did you catch your faith?
My grandmother, we met every Sunday after church. Afternoon, we went to visit. And she was definitely the one who gave me. She sometimes said, why do you question things? You take it as it is said in the Bible. If it's a virgin birth, it's a virgin birth, and there's no two things about it. So she was the one.
Mine was my father. If there was a church service, we were at it. We went to youth group and Sunday school. My father was a very patriarchal, controlling person who unfortunately had a daughter who was known to be kind of strong-willed from time to time. So we didn't always see eye to eye, but I'll be forever grateful for his foundation and the church that he gave me. Can't pay that back.
My wife Kathy.
I'd have to say my mother. She was really an interesting person. She was valedictorian of her high school class. She grew up in town and married a farmer. But she had a subtle way of managing everything. And so she would not directly move into something, she would ease into it. And the thing that she did, we were Episcopalian, but the church service was in town. It was too early for us on the farm to make it. My father's reaction was, okay, so what? And my mother's was, that's not good enough. So she started taking all of us when we were quite young to a Bible church in a nearby community called Edwards, Illinois. And through that subtle movement, my mother eased all of us into that.
Well, I'd have to say my mother, my father. Of course, my family, the Helmies, go back to when they lived in Germany, and they came to this country in 1734. In fact, my transport was in 1750. And we were Germans, and the German Salzburgers, if any of you heard me give that presentation, settled outside of Savannah, and of course, they're Lutherans, and that was all I knew. And my mother was the president at that time, when I was growing up 8 years old. She was president of the Georgia, Alabama Women's Missionary Society. And she taught me faith because she made me sing a solo when I was 8 years old in Jerusalem Lutheran Church at the opening of the Georgia Presbyterian Association. So I'd have to say my mother and my father. Thank you.
And how do you live out that faith? What does that look like for you?
I'd say one thing. That's by the way I live, I hope. I don't know how else to do it.
Amen.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that you can look at me and see a man of faith.
I'm the same. I sort of took on the, we are Christians by our love, and to confront everything with love.
I would agree to that, but my faith is not as strong as it should be. In fact,
Same, right?
I'm wishy-washy, and I very often think of myself as a fair-weather Christian. I didn't go to church for many, many years because I was angry at God. He took my son, and I prayed so hard for his. I said, take me, I'm old enough. He's only 42. He didn't listen. So I was angry, and I didn't want to go to church at all, and I stayed away for a while.
Good news is God can handle that, right? I would call that a journey. Time in the wilderness is something we all spend time there. So, thank you to all of you. I wish we had another 2 hours to hear more stories, but alas, we do not. So I would turn it over to Dan or Sylvia, whoever's praying this out.
Again, I'd like to thank you all for sharing your time and your stories with us. And so I'd like to close this in prayer, if you would join me in this. Good and gracious Spirit, lover of all that you have made, I ask that you continue to bless us in this community through these stories, that we learn to listen, to see beyond